Hi, and welcome to The Leader's Edge, our weekly live interview show where Georgia Donaldson and I, Emily Chiva, feature successful CEOs and professionals who are so kind to share their stories with us. We want to bring awareness, inspiration, and leadership tips for you to action to help you sharpen your competitive advantage and make a positive impact in your organization and community. Remember, if you are watching us live, you can leave us a comment on LinkedIn if you want to ask a question for us to address on this show. So the topic this week is strategy to action. How to run your business or run your business rather without it running you. What an interesting title. I love it. So before we bring on our wonderful guest, Keita Demming, who authored this wonderful book and whom Georgia will properly introduce in a second, I want to invite you, you all know the drill by now, to bring to your awareness your own response on a couple of questions when it comes to strategy. And if you want, you can make a note of this or share it with us in the comments when you listen to this, either live or later on. So the first question is, what comes to your mind when you think of strategy or strategic planning and the like? Are these thoughts of excitement or thoughts of drudgery because you see this as a boring, useless process? And the second question in your business and in your personal life is, have you come up with your strategy yet for 2025? As you think about your answers to these questions, I invite Georgia now to introduce Keita and let him lead us off in a discussion with the story of how he decided to write this book and why he called it Strategy to Action. So, Georgia, take us away.
Wo- Wonderful. Thank you, Emily. Good morning. Hi,
Good
Keita.
morning.
It is lovely having you this morning. And The Leader's Edge is back for season 3. And we are making sure that we pull out all the stops this morning on our first trip. Keita Demming, the PhD. And when you think of some words, if you put these 3 words together, listen to these. If you put author, if you put educator, and if you put coach in one sentence, do you know what you get? Google that. And what do you get? Keita Demming. And if you put the words strategy to action as a book, Google that. What do you get? You get the same gentleman who is sitting right here in front of us this morning. So he wrote that book, he said, as a practical methodology that will turn your ideas into real offerings. And if you're in business and you see that there's a gap between action and your strategy moving into action, he's the gentleman who's going to help you with that. So Keita is with us this morning. And Keita, we're flipping your book name onto you and asking you what moved you into action to focus on strategy.
First of all, thank you for having me on the show. It's my first one for the new year, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. But let's get right into it. Um, I think like many innovations, I was trying to solve a problem that I was seeing with my clients. So I was never happy with how my clients were thinking about strategy and then executing on those two things. And I was beginning to think that that's the most important thing that anybody who's trying to build a business is doing is you have to figure out what is your strategy and you have to think about how you're going to execute that. And I was getting too many people who thought that strategy is a waste of time. I've written the strategy, it's on the shelf, etc. So what's a way we could make strategy very practical, make it so that people can find it useful, so that um, they can use it in their everyday life. And one of the best things that I hear from people who I work with is I have a strategy quadrant and it sits right next to me. And a strategy quadrant, for the listeners who don't know, the book will go, if you read the book and you follow the book or you download any of my content, it's a strategy quadrant is what you're creating. You're creating 4 boxes that give you a strategy and the execution plan. What people like about that is they have a 1 page strategy that is on bullet points and they can look to see how do I iterate on this on a regular basis. And that's where it came from. It came from real life experiences where my clients were struggling with it. And I decided there must be a better way to think about how we close the gap between strategy and action. And I'll give you my favorite example of strategy right now.
Mm-hmm.
There's a company called Bandit, and Bandit is a clothing company. Now, Bandit is competing with Nike, Adidas, Asics, all the big brand names, but it has a budget. So what Bandit did is they told for the Olympics, they told any athlete who's unsponsored, you can wear our Bandit clothes and we will give you a small sponsorship. What did is that gave Bandit visibility at the Olympic trials and not a lot of spend, and it solved the problem for athletes. Athletes had to wear a brand when they were running, even if they were unsponsored. And anybody who's wearing this black Bandit uniform and another company knew, okay, that person there is unsponsored, we can go after that person. And that's an example of how they were able to use limited resources to compete on that kind of stage. So if you just break it down, I see Nigel's in the chat, and
Yes.
strategy is actually a hypothesis. It's how do I test this to make sure that the things I'm doing in the world are true? Is my strategy? I like to say a strategy is a temporary holding position. As long as the assumptions that went into your strategy remain true, you keep that strategy. Once the assumptions change, you begin to change that strategy. And the strategy is just about two things. Really, ultimately, it's about how do we help this company and people in the company make better decisions that
Mhm.
are aligned. That's ultimately what it is. But it's really about how do you allocate resources, create alignment in a way that you win. That is what strategy is. And most people do not think on that level because we find it too theoretical and not practical enough. And really, without a framework within which you're making decisions, if you're going up against a company that has a solid framework and has a solid strategy, you're likely not to succeed in the way that you hoped or wanted to.
Mhm. Great. I wanted to recognize, and you did, you recognized our friend who is on, Nigel Romano. And Nigel is saying it really is to solve a problem. Strategies about diagnosis, policy, and action. Thanks for that contribution, Nigel. So you are demystifying strategy, Keto.
Yeah, I'm in the book. I'm trying to make it actionable, trying to make it
Yeah.
simple.
Yeah.
So one of the things we talk about is you have to make things as simple as possible without removing complexity. So now that's what I try to do with
Mhm.
the framework. I try to get people to think about strategy in a very simple way.
Yeah.
Yet it keeps it robust. It still makes it a robust approach
Hmm.
that gives you solid results. Because if you don't get the results, then what are we really doing here?
What's the
Um,
Mm.
point?
what's the point? So that's kind of where a lot of it came down. And because I believe I'm not a big fan of education because I don't think education necessarily results in change. So, for example, most smokers know that smoking is bad for them and they don't stop smoking.
True.
Something like 40% of people who have a heart attack go back to their old ways 8 months after their heart attack. So it's not about education.
Hmm.
It's there are a whole bunch of things you have to do to make change happen, right? So, which is why I believe in a coaching approach, because the coaching approach says, okay, I'm going to join you on this journey and I'll coach you along the way. So you go from A to B rather than, hey, let me give you this educational course that
Right.
you read. You never do the things in that course. And you blame the course person and you don't realize how hard change is to begin with, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
But
that,
I mean, I think I read somewhere as in another program that I do, but insight is only 20%. 80% is the action. So if
right?
you
Ah,
don't actually take some kind of action to allow, like if you're changing a habit or you make trying to create a new habit, the insight is like, yeah, aha. So you get that when you get
mhm.
the education. And all the ideas, you write them down. I remember going to courses, writing down everything, and like, yeah, this looks great. Come back to the office and right, you just get back into your day. So over time, you just kind of not, you lose it, unfortunately. So I'm very much, and so is Georgia. We're very much into the coaching.
Mhm.
Well, as coaches ourselves, very much into understanding how to, you do need that support and that continuous momentum to allow for the changes to be made. And as you said, Kita, I mean, the beauty of your book is that it is a simple read because I read it over my Christmas break. Because I mean, going into New Year business, I said, this, and we actually got this recommended, Georgia, to us by one of our other guests on the show, Rachel Rennie, when she was on. She had said that she read this book, and I made a note, and I said I have to look this up, and I looked it up, and I was like, I have to get this book, and it was really an interesting read. Whether you're in your own business, you're doing it this for yourself as a person just trying to figure out what you want to do, in terms of your own life. Because I think, Kita, you put there was I think the earliest versions of this was when you were in school, right, in college, and things started to fall apart, and you kind of started to put yourself on a plan to get you to complete it without disappointing your parents.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
The actually that's one of the most surprising things about, and this is the thing about. So my own evolution in having written this book is I now define myself as a creator. I used to define myself as an educator, academic, and I just realized that I'm a creator. I create things. I create educational content frameworks that help people improve in their lives in some way. How do they redefine their own performance?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
the most surprising thing about this book is I wrote this book for entrepreneurs, business owners to think about how do I create alignment in my company. That was the purpose of the book. The most surprising thing is that where I'm seeing the most people with the most gains is people who are taking the quadrant and applying it to their life.
Mhm.
So how do I create alignment in my own life and then do the same thing in my business? And I did not intend for that to happen. That was not my intention. But a lot of people who are coming to me have said, "Hey, I put my life into a quadrant. My wife and I did this thing, and yeah, I had some clients who've done that before, but I had not, because my market areas and more on the business side. I didn't really pay attention to that side, but
Yeah.
Mhm.
it's been the most surprising thing for me since. And that's the other thing too is you put a book out there, you put some intellectual piece out there, and then people make it their own. They do things with it that you would surprise you, and you're like, wow, you know. So that's something that stood out to me so far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kita,
Yeah.
there's one comment I saw about the book, and I said, wow, this is beautiful. It says, view your organization as a conversation rather than a machine. Talk to us about that. View your organization as a conversation rather than a machine.
Yeah, so that comes from a woman called Patricia Shaw. And Patricia Shaw is like a complexity theorist that I had studied when I did my master's. And she talked about how conversations you change the organization by changing the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, most of our I could write a whole book. In fact, when I first wanted to write this book, I wanted to write a book about why management theory has led us so wrong because it's called management science. And we
Mm-hmm.
try to apply this very hard science to what is really a social science, which is how humans
Mm.
interact and operate, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So there are some fundamental flaws there in that approach, and that worked really, really well in the industrial era. In the knowledge economy area, where you're dealing with a um, lot less factory type kind of work, we need a very different framework. So that was what originally I was going to write about. And my publisher was like, "Yeah, that's a textbook, but you're writing a book for like an audience." And that ended up just being like a chapter. I just wrote that into a chapter. But the general idea is that we have to get away from thinking about organizations as machines and start to think about them as conversations.
Yes.
I believe conversation is the action. So I'll give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
Emily and I, we got connected online. We had a conversation, and in that conversation, we created the future, which is today, us having this conversation today.
Yes.
Nothing we do happens without conversation. Nothing. And the first conversation is conversation with ourselves. Should I do this thing or not? Well, I've been thinking about this idea. Should I? And we have this conversation with ourselves. Then
Mm-hmm.
we have conversations with other people, and then we build the future through the conversations you have. And people don't recognize that the conversation is the action. So there are two things I really focus on. strategy and conversations. How do we help people have better conversations so they have better outcomes, better lives, better businesses, etc. Right. So to me, that's where the idea of conversations comes from. It's a very simple one, but I really believe that to become a high performer, you have to master the conversation environment. And I think if I ever wrote a second book, it would be all about conversations for sure.
Oh, we're looking forward to that one. And
Okay.
guess what, Dr. Deming, you are validating that it's okay for me to talk to myself.
Oh, 100%. Oh, 100%.
Talk to
100%.
myself all the time.
But who has more influence on you than you?
There you go. There you go.
No, nobody has more influence on you than you. And how you talk to yourself is probably the most important piece.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, for
Yes.
example, I had a really tough time about a year and a half ago where my son was, the way he was talking to himself was awful. He was like, I'm terrible, I'm a bad boy. And he was beginning to get that narrative.
Mhm.
And I had to, like, I interjected really quickly on that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You don't talk to yourself like that. And he
Mhm.
was 5, right? And I think he's lucky that I'm his dad. There's some people might not pick up on that and they have that internal monologue for years. And it takes them years to get over that.
Yes, to get it over. Yeah.
Conversation with yourself is so underrated and it is probably one of the most important. I'll give you a skill for that.
Mhm.
There's something called a fly in the wall technique
Hmm.
where you like LeBron James uses this a lot. So you imagine yourself as a fly on the wall and you look at yourself and you talk to yourself from that third person perspective, or you build your persona of yourself. What would Keita 2.0 do in this situation? So Keto
Mhm.
2.0 is somebody who runs every day, exercises every day, etc. So in this situation where I don't feel like running, what would Keto 2.0 do?
Right.
Right? I act from that place rather than
Mhm.
acting from my current self, right?
Right.
And taking that step away makes a massive difference in terms of action and motivation and how you're able to do things. So to your point, I think the conversation with yourself is huge, which is why I believe in coaching, which is why I think coaching is so powerful.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Yes. So
Wonderful.
good.
So I'm noticing the time and we're over. It
Oh
always
gosh,
happens.
we have to do
We and
we have to do
I
the
like it. We have a ton of
2.0.
questions. We yeah. So I mean, I feel like people who have listened to us, who's going to listen to us on the replay here, really think about getting this book. If you have been struggling with thinking of how to frame your strategy, um, even if you're thinking of how to envision your future and make it something that is actionable. I think oftentimes we do this strategy exercise, and it really does remain as just that, an exercise, a long
Mhm.
exercise where we go through a lot of stuff. And how are we really making sure there's alignment and action and things that are that it becomes simple, like Keita said in the framework that he raised. And this idea of conversations, I mean, that was part of what he discussed in the book as well. And I think we just touched on it a little bit, not just the conversations with ourselves, but all the conversations that we're having and the questions that we're asking. Because if we ask better questions, we get better answers, right? So think about those things, and I hope you're
can I
getting
just
some nuggets in which you want to action for yourself this week, whether it's get the book, think about your conversations, go check out Keita's many podcasts and resources that he has online. And what else, what else can you do if you haven't yet started to think about what you want for 2025? Remember, if you don't actually think about it, you just get whatever, you just get what
Mhm.
you always got. So think about, where am I going? What do I want to get? How am I going to get there? So if you start thinking of those questions, whether it's in business or in your personal life, you might find some very interesting answers. And then you will wake up 6 months, a year down the road, and you realize that you've been doing some of those things and you're becoming a very different version of yourself.
can I just say one thing
Yes.
there? I think the people who I think, and I don't mean in terms of money, I don't mean success in terms of money. I mean holistic success.
Mhm.
People
Mhm.
who are happily married, financially free, have some kind of freedom in terms of how they spend their time, etc. They may not be the wealthiest people that you meet, but they're definitely the happiest and their successes, their health is in order, all of that. I think the reason that that happens is these people are intentional with their lives.
Mm-hmm.
The goal is to live an intentional, purposeful life. So things that the Socratic philosophers talked about, things like what Plato talked about, those kinds of things about asking questions around what's the meaning of life, which can seem esoteric and very, very meaningless. But if you wake up every day with a very clear intention, your life could look very, very different 6 months, a year from now, because you're being intentional about what you're doing.
Yes.
And most of us, what we have to do is we have to take stuff off of our plate rather than add to our plate. We have
Yeah.
to, most of us, it's about what do we take off rather than put on.
Mhm.
And there's a very, it's almost overused where we talk about most of us overestimate what we can do in a year and underestimate what we can do in 10 years, right?
Mhm.
It's a very
Mm-hmm.
famous quote around that. But the key is
Mhm.
learning to think on a much longer time horizon.
Right.
If you take anything around, anything away from this book that I'm talking about, this framework, the framework that I'm using is I want you to start thinking on a much longer time horizon. I think that skill alone would transform families, companies,
Mm-hmm.
countries. If we just start to think, plan, and act on a much longer time horizon, it transforms everything. So let's use politics as an example. The biggest reason we have political challenges, at least in the Caribbean, is our political timeframes of 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very few of our policymakers and politicians are thinking past 5 years. The countries that are thriving, the New Zealands of the world, the Finlands, we like to use those the Scandinavian countries. They're thinking
Mm-hmm.
100-year plans. They're thinking 200 years from now, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I think that is the biggest piece that if you just start to think on a much longer time horizon, it's a very simple mind move, but it's absolutely transformative mind move. How do you think, act, and plan on a much longer time horizon?
Right.
That's what this book is about. This book is about getting you to be very intentional about this is the life I want, and I'm going to go after it.
Mm-hmm.
And I might be aiming for the stars and land on the moon, but that's fine. But this is the life I want to, and I'm being very intentional about that. And anything that's a distraction from that is one of the key questions in that book is this action I'm about to take serving the future I want? If
Right.
the answer is no, take it off your plate ASAP.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so many distractions. So that's the only thing I just want to add that like as people start to think about um, setting their goals for 2025 and all that, it's about being intentional and being iterative. That's the other thing that I found is missing in most strategy. Most strategies like a linear plan.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get something that's iterative? How do we get something that we could look at that and then rethink all of our assumptions and make sure that it's iterative? Because I felt that's a very small section of the book, but I think it's probably one of the pieces that needs to be amplified the most.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
Okay.
So, Keita, it's really how to run our lives and our businesses without them running us.
It is, yeah.
Wonderful.
It is.
Thank you so much for sharing with us this morning.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Thank you.
having me. All right.
All right.
Pleasure.
And if Keita, if there's anything you want us to share in terms of how people can get in touch with you, you could always message me. I'll put it in the chat, or you can put it in on LinkedIn as well. Any links or
Yes.
anything. I think Keita's work is brilliant. So people, please listen to what he said. Be intentional. Think about the future, long term, and
Mm-hmm.
then take action, small steps. Is this serving my long term? That's just the question to ask. And if it's not, then you know what
Mm-hmm.
to do.
Take it off your plate.
Take it off your plate. Thank you, everyone. It has been great.
Take care. Have a lovely week.
Yeah.